just a quick rundown of today's webinar. We are going to start with some comments from the Western Governors Association. They're going to provide us a little bit of overview of what they've been doing under the Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative and where things stand now and where things go from here. We're also going to make sure that we provide all of our viewers today access to that report. So be looking in the chat for a link to the WGA Heat Beneath Our Feet report. After that, we're going to go into a presentation on a report that I led for the National Renewable Energy Lab called Topics and Considerations for Developing State Geothermal Regulations. I'm going to walk through some key findings and an overview of that report. And then I'm joined today by a couple of panelists that worked with me developing that report. And we're going to have a short panel discussion before opening it up to the audience for Q&A. I would ask that for any questions we have today, please put your questions in the chat. We'll have somebody on the NREL side, our communications representative, Kelly McGregor, monitoring that for us. And we will save the last 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A with the audience. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen Edmond from the Western Governors Association to give us some quick remarks on the Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative.
Thank you, Aaron. And as Aaron mentioned, my name is Stephen Edmond. I am the Energy Policy Advisor for Western Governors Association. If you're not familiar with WGA, we help represent the bipartisan positions of the westernmost governors of 22 states and territories. And the development of sustainable energy resources is a major priority for every Western governor. The West has been a focal point for geothermal for many years and represents a valuable but underdeveloped resource. WGA this last June published our Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative report and is complemented nicely by NREL's report that we'll be discussing today. Led by Colorado Governor Jared Polis, the Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative includes recommendations on what can be done at the federal level to accelerate the development and deployment of geothermal energy. If you wanted to see the full report, you can either go to westgov.org or click on the link that'll be provided in the chat today. Aaron, I think it's really important to note that throughout our initiative, we held an expansive stakeholder process that was open to the public, and we received interest about geothermal, ranging from local homeowners to multi-state utility companies that are looking at geothermal energy. And what NREL's report does is it provides a very important tool made available to our states who wish to tap into this incredible resource. As technology advances and new techniques and practices are deployed, many of the topics in this report will have to be considered by state regulators. Geothermal energy has many end uses and will play an important role in meeting climate-related goals set forth by our states, from making homes more energy efficient to providing clean and dispatchable electricity. WGA is excited for the future of geothermal in the West. During our initiative, we found many of the same considerations mentioned in NREL's report. From mineral right ownership to exploratory drilling, these are going to have to be considered by states wishing to develop geothermal. I know that staff from our governor's offices and our state agencies will be tuning in today. And I just wanted to extend a thank you and our gratitude to the entire team at NREL, as well as the Geothermal Technology Office for publishing this important tool for our states. Thank you for letting me join today, and I look forward to hearing the conversation with our other panelists.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. And again, we do have this, we'll have this report available in the chat, and I certainly encourage everyone to review both reports if you haven't had a chance to already. So with that, I'm going to move into just an overview of the report we developed out of NREL. This was a multi-year effort, and it really, the background of this report started with the 2019 Department of Energy's GeoVision and an associated NREL task force report on non-technical barriers that I co-led. And during that process, we identified numerous states in the eastern and southern United States that did not have geothermal regulations at all for power production or direct use. We also heard from a number of other stakeholders in Western states that had regulations and statutes that maybe had been around for decades, as long as 50 plus years, that were considering, what updates needed to be made to promote industry within their states and to make it make sense for evolving and new geothermal technologies. And so in general, this lack of geothermal regulations or dated geothermal regulations were identified as a potential risk for geothermal development and for new developers to enter these jurisdictions. And so based off of that, the Geothermal Technologies Office at the Department of Energy funded NREL to lead an effort to develop a report summarizing existing state and federal geothermal regulations and key considerations for state level decision makers. These can be, decision makers at the governor's offices, within individual agencies, as well as state legislatures. And so we went about this process by first completing a 50-state survey, reviewing and cataloging a number of topics and considerations to advise our group in drafting this report. This included the definition of the geothermal resource, the ownership of the geothermal resource, what types of permits and approvals were needed to conduct subsurface exploration and development. We also compiled a number of best practices from geothermal and other extractive industries, looking specifically to oil and gas and mining. And then ultimately, we established a volunteer geothermal regulatory stakeholder working group. I'm joined by a couple members of that working group today for our panel discussion. Ultimately, this was comprised of both geothermal and oil and gas industry representatives, a number of state regulators, and academia and others to advise the report and the considerations to include in that report. Our group met approximately once a month for about a year to discuss topics and go through these considerations, review draft sections of the report, and lead us to our ultimate publication. Here's a quick snapshot of some of what we found. Ultimately, as you can see here, we do generally see geothermal regulatory programs in Western states. And again, some of these might have been around for decades and be looking to update at this point. And certainly you can see for the Western Governors Association footprint that we did find regulations in these states. But as you move to the east and southern parts of the United States, we see less and less of that. We would see in some states, and these are the kind of dashed states where we'd see a definition of the geothermal resource, but not necessarily a full regulatory program. And then many other states, while they might have had something for ground source heat pumps at very shallow levels, did not have what we were looking for in terms of, deeper direct use and power production for both conventional and non-conventional geothermal applications. So the scope of our report really focused on geothermal power production and direct use technologies, with the exception of ground source heat pumps and the use of the subsurface as thermal sinks. Those, while certainly of interest to many, and certainly those maybe in eastern parts of the country, were just simply outside the scope of what we were focused on for this report. And then ultimately our report focused up to the point of utilization. So we really tried to focus on the subsurface aspect of this and did not get into PUC approvals and other approvals associated with generating and selling the power itself. We broke our report down into really 5 main sections, looking at the resource ownership and definition, the leasing process, the exploration approval process, the process to drill a full to well field to ultimately utilize for a surface application such as direct use or power production. And then we also looked into underground injection control, recognizing that injection is a key part of the geothermal subsurface development and utilization process. I'm going to walk through at a high level just some of the key findings we had within each of these sections before we open it up to our panel for discussion. So first, looking to the ownership and the definition of the geothermal resource, I think it's worth noting that both the federal government and states vary widely in terms of how this is couched. And it's something that we noticed right off the bat that, we would see things such as temperature thresholds, whether the resource was treated as a mineral right, a water right, something that ran with the surface. There wasn't really a lot of consistency across states. And ultimately, this led us to a few key considerations, one of which was the use of a specific temperature threshold could lead to multiple regulatory regimes, as well as the potential need for water rights or additional permitting requirements. We saw ranges from anywhere from maybe 30 degrees C to over 100 degrees C as where the cutoff was for what was defined as a geothermal resource. And in many cases, under that resource, there was a different regime. Say if it was 100 C cutoff, under 100 C might be one regulatory regime, over 100 C might be a different regulatory regime. They might have different impacts on water rights. And so that's a key consideration for those drafting these regulations to consider if you really are looking to create multiple regimes within your program, or you're looking to create consistency across geothermal applications. We also saw, again, these water rights issues that a number of states within their definition, either excluded or included water rights or the geothermal brine, which can have implication. States may want to consider terms such as heat, in addition to terms like fluid, and really define what is encompassed within that geothermal right. Secondly, we look to the leasing process. And so within the leasing process, and generally the rights to acquire geothermal development interest, we also identified a number of considerations. For the most part, we saw these fall into two categories, either that being competitive or non-competitive leasing. By that, I mean, a competitive process in which there is some sort of process in which applicants can bid on and compete for the interest, with the highest qualified bidder being awarded the rights, and non-competitive leasing typically being kind of a first come, first serve approach. Generally, we were focused here on state managed lands and mineral interests. So the private, sector is much different and typically wouldn't be subject to a competitive leasing process. Whereas for public lands specifically, there is tends to be the aspect of competitive leasing as a default in many places. We did see also some exceptions to this. And so I think a couple of the key exceptions here are, the type of development. Typically we would see more non-competitive applications for direct use. These could be focused on because the proximity to end use is such that there needs to be a specific location for that development. We also saw, even in those cases, where if there was competing interest over that same resource, and maybe within certain filing ranges, then that might revert to a competitive process. We also saw some interesting things, particularly at the federal level, in terms of nexus to oil and gas wells or mining operations. At the federal level, there are both provisions for non-competitive leases to be issued at an existing mining claim, or where there's existing oil and gas wells that have already been leased and approved by the federal agency, typically the Bureau of Land Management. And so that was another consideration where you might see what typically would be competitive default to non-competitive. Another aspect that came up was kind of lease terms. And so one key consideration is a state may consider wanting to use lease terms without a fixed end date, and focus more on the viable kind of production of the resource and have it stay active as long as there is a viable producing resource. We saw some states with fixed end dates that could create complications down the line. We recognize that geothermal resources can last for decades, and the geysers, for example, in Northern California have been producing for, I believe, 50 plus years. And so those are type of interests that you want to consider and not have a fixed end date that would create complications for a viable continuing product. The next section, I really want to focus on exploration and drilling together. I think a lot of the considerations cut across the two areas. And so, we've seen various approaches to exploration and drilling, and what is considered exploration, what is considered drilling. This varies at both the state and federal level. We've seen at the state level that states may want to consider whether exploration will be limited to leased or unleased lands. One key consideration there also is if you are going to allow exploration on unleased lands, is there some sort of incentive or pathway to a non-competitive lease that really incentivizes someone to actually go out and explore and search for resources on that land? It's something that we've seen at the federal level go back and forth. Previously, before EPAC 2005, if you were outside of a known geothermal resource area and you explored unleased lands, you could then get a non-competitive right. Since EPAC 2005, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, we've seen that move to a competitive process, even if you are identifying something outside of a known geothermal resource area. And what it does is it really can create a disincentive to put effort and financial resources into exploration when you would have to nominate that parcel and then compete against other interests to obtain that resource. And so something to consider there is, if you are going to allow that, is there a pathway and something that incentivizes someone to do so? We also found that states should be specific with what is permitted under an exploration permit versus drilling permit. We saw a number of these that might be focused, say, solely on geophysical development and really have a clear cutoff of what type of activities are allowed under exploration. Others that were more unified and inclusive. And if you were drilling for the purposes of, say, exploration, it didn't really matter if you, say, come into contact with the resource, the depth to which you're drilling, it was a single process. And at the federal level, this is also something where we see a pretty clear distinction, under a notice of intent to conduct geothermal exploration operations, that is limited up to TG wells, temperature gradient wells, and cannot come into contact with the geothermal resource itself. Anything beyond that requires a geothermal drilling permit under their geothermal drilling permit program. And so, this is something for states to consider. And if you are looking to maybe unify your processes and create, a more streamlined approach, it might be worthwhile to consider, does it make sense to have a single process for exploration drilling or a single process for all types of drilling, and really focus on those considerations involved with the drilling itself, as opposed to creating these distinct processes between exploration and drilling that have different permitting requirements. A few additional considerations that came up within the drilling side of things is depth of drilling. And this is something here in my home state of Colorado that we've seen with new geothermal regulations and legislation that has been passed, and regulations that are forthcoming that really focused on delineating deep drilling from what they call shallow drilling. And so created two different processes for drilling greater than 2,500 feet in depth and less than that. So that's another consideration that we've seen, and whether a state wants to take that approach and look at different regimes for shallow versus deep geothermal drilling. Another one is the type of development. Are there different requirements that you would like to place on conventional versus non-conventional drilling? Are there seismic concerns? Are there other concerns that you want to consider within that approach? And then finally, consider that there's going to necessarily, at some point in many projects, be the need to modify wells. Either the change of use of the well, maybe it goes from an exploration well to a monitoring well that's used to observe the site, or maybe there's a need to re-drill some of the well. And so states should be considering and make sure they have processes in place to allow for either the conversion of use or the modification and re-drilling of the well itself. And then finally, I wanted to cover just some key considerations for the underground injection control process. And so for those that aren't as familiar, the underground injection control process is driven by the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act and administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. But states may seek to obtain primacy from the EPA for either all classes of UIC wells or specific classes of UIC wells. Specifically, geothermal injection wells are classified as Class 5 UIC wells. That tends to be a catch-all class that includes a number of different well types. And so that's another factor to consider, is that, and we might discuss this a little bit in terms of if you are looking to take primacy, you typically are not able to take primacy, say, over just geothermal injection wells. It's at a class level. And so taking on Class 5 primacy would constitute taking on more than just geothermal and other types of injection that are classified under Class 5. Many states we've seen have Class 2 primacy, which is the oil and gas injection wells, but we saw much fewer that have actual primacy over Class 5. And so within that, here's a list of just some states that we noticed through our review that had Class 5 primacy, that have geothermal development, including Idaho, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, and Utah. something that one of our panelists might be able to speak to during Q&A is the approach taken by California, which California does not have Class 5 primacy, but they do have an agreement with the EPA in regards to geothermal injection wells. And so that is a little more unique, I believe, MOU type relationship between the state and the EPA, as opposed to going through the formal process of taking on primacy. Within our report, we do provide some more detail on what it looks like to actually request primacy from the EPA and what that process entails. And then finally, another section we focused on is really looking at what is that interrelationship between environmental review and geothermal development. And here's an example from a previous report, the Geothermal Vision Study, Geothermal Division report, that looks at the federal level and the number of times and places at which an EA or EIS, environmental assessment or environmental impact statement under the National Environmental Policy Act would be triggered. And so this might occur on the agency side at land use planning or pre-leasing analysis before they put up a parcel for competitive or non-competitive leasing. And then it might also occur during phases of development. So you might see development at the exploration stage that requires NEPA compliance, either through a categorical exclusion or environmental assessment, at well field development through an environmental assessment. And then, sometimes even at the power plant and transmission stage, this might arise to an EIS. That could be an EA still, but we have seen in more complex situations where there's large scale development and potential significant impacts that can rise to an EIS at that phase. And so thinking about this, there's just a number of points in which environmental review can be triggered. And so if the state that you're operating in does have an environmental review process, it is important to consider the interplay and interrelationship between that environmental review process and the geothermal permitting and leasing aspects from a standpoint that this can lead to time increases inherent just from completing these reviews. We typically see, because of this on the federal side, that development takes 7 to 10 years. Some of the analysis completed for the GeoVision study identified that there's potentially 2 to 3 years of time saving that could occur from consolidating some of those environmental reviews to fewer phases or fewer triggers. Ultimately, that might be outside the scope of your ability when you're drafting and revising any sort of state geothermal legislation and regulations, but I think it is something worth considering of what will the impact in a relationship be between the two. And so with this, some concluding thoughts before we move into our panel discussion is, states without existing geothermal regulations or states looking to update geothermal regulations, hopefully will find the information in this report helpful to inform their policymakers and decision makers on what regulatory approaches make sense for each of your individual states. We provide a number of examples from across the states that we looked at within the report, and I certainly encourage you to dive deeper into the report. I believe that we do have the link in the chat. I also have it here on the screen as a QR code for those who are just looking to quickly maybe snap a picture here, so they have it as well. But with that, I'm really going to conclude the presentation portion of our session today and move into a panel discussion with a couple panelists that served on our voluntary geothermal regulatory stakeholder working group. And so with that, I invite Charlene Wardlow, who I believe now is, she can maybe let us know, officially formerly with CalGEM. Charlene is retiring right now. And so really happy for Charlene. For those who don't know Charlene, she has been a long-term stakeholder in the geothermal industry, wearing multiple hats from researcher to on the project development side to on the regulator side, and just has a wealth of experience. And we really hope that Charlene stays engaged and connected to our community as she enters this next phase. And we'll see if she can keep herself retired and keep herself busy. And then we also have, I believe, another panelist is with us right now. If I can, oh, yes, there she is. Sorry, couldn't see you, Janine. So we have Janine Vanny from Ever Technologies, representing more of our industry side. Janine can speak to her background a little bit, but Janine was also a member of our stakeholder working group, and she's here representing some of the perspectives of industry. And so with that, I'm going to move into A few questions that we had for our panelists to discuss before we open it up to the audience for Q&A. And so Janine and Charlene, first I'm going to start with this first question. Should geothermal regulations be kind of quote unquote technology agnostic and apply equally to direct use? And again, we're talking about more deep direct use as opposed to ground source heat pumps, conventional power production such as hydrothermal development, as well as non-conventional power generation such as newer technologies such as closed loop or EGS, enhanced geothermal systems. So I don't know if one of you want to take a stab at this first, but looking forward to hearing your responses.
Yeah, sure. I can take a stab. Thanks for inviting me to be here today on behalf of the geothermal industry. My background is geoscience, and I am by no means a permitting expert. So, I think the general feeling is that yes, geothermal regulation should be technology agnostic. I think, one of the key reasons is we need to plan for the future. There are some nascent technologies that are coming to fruition now, but there's going to be even more in the future. And so we really need to try and reduce regulatory burden. And I think if we have different sets of regulations for nuanced technologies, that would create a burden and sort of be the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. I guess an example of that would be drilling, like we're trying to talk mostly about subsurface today, so not sort of the PUCN type approvals. And I think, one of the biggest foundational aspects to any geothermal technology is the drilling of deep wells. And so drilling regulations need to be fit for purpose to protect, the environment and health and safety. And I think, when you look at oil and gas, it's the same thing. There are different play types, different technologies being used, but there is a set of regulations. And as technology evolves, typically, the regulations can evolve with it. And not necessarily I do think there's tweaks that have to happen for the nuances, but in general, one regulation would be best. I think a good analogy, although it's federal, is something that Aaron touched on already, is that the categorical exclusions is an example of, it's a historical, like the STEAM Act is a historical act, and the categorical exclusions really are set for hydrothermal. So the way that they explore and develop a resource. The next gen geothermal generation technologies need to do a bit more, I'd say, resource delineation. So to go in with monitoring wells or calibration wells, and the express purpose of that is to touch the reservoir so that you can delineate it, so you know how to design your well construction profiles. So that's just one example, sort of on the federal side, that would be good for states to consider when designing regulation. Aaron, I'm finished my statement. I don't know if you can hear me or not, but
Aaron, you're muted.
Okay. Aaron, I can go next if you'd like. So, okay. Well, good morning. And yes, I'm officially retired the 29th of this month after almost 40 years in the geothermal industry. I have a petroleum engineering background and spent the last 7+ years with the California Geologic Energy Management Division, which regulates geothermal wells, low and high temperature on state and private lands in the state of California. One of the things we've been working on is updating our 40+-year-old regulations. And one of the things we've been looking at is these new technologies that are coming, such as enhanced geothermal systems and systems that are just using the heat. And the concern is the well completion. Well completion is obviously can be different in a low temperature resource that could potentially be drilled more like a water well, use PVC pipe versus a geothermal well that requires carbon steel pipe or even different metallurgies to ensure protection of underground sources of drinking water. And even if it's a geothermal project that's not going to use a geothermal resource, there could still even be geothermal resources that will be behind pipe that could be corrosive or hot. And so we're still concerned about the well construction, the cementing, because usually geothermal wells are cemented from the bottom of the casing shoe to the surface, because you want to ensure not only integrity of the well, but protection of any resources behind pipe. And so the goal is not to have too prescriptive of regulations, but that they are written such that you ensure protection of all resources, whether it's the geothermal resource or anything behind pipe. And there's a lot of new technology in well drilling and cementing that you want to ensure that your regulations have the flexibility to address the new technologies coming, but that also all the resources, even water resources, biological, any of the other resources in the area are protected.
Great. Thanks, Charlene. On this next question, I'm going to start with Janine, and I know we've talked about this previously, Janine. How large of a risk is entering into a state without geothermal regulations for geothermal project development? And does this uncertainty deter investment and development? And then, in addition, maybe thinking about what about states that have geothermal regulations, but may not fit squarely within non-conventional geothermal development, such as Ever's closed loop technology?
I mean, I think it does depend a little bit on the size of the company and the ability to support protracted project development timelines. But in general, I would say it is viewed as a core risk to project development, and depending on the size of your company, maybe even your firm. So I guess maybe I'll speak a little bit to Ever's portfolio process, because that's what I know. But most companies do have a portfolio of projects they're pursuing. And, regulatory regime is typically one of the first boxes you look to check when deciding where to deploy, your limited resources. So, whether it's access to market or the ability to get on the grid or to get drilling permits approved or your environmental permits. In general, like the more uncertainty you have, the more cumulative effects will pile up, and it is a big deterrent. An example is most projects have like what's called stage gate processes. You're probably aware of that, depending on who's in the audience. And so you go from sort of what is termed, exploration through to development and execution and production. And so, but to get through that final investment gate, typically inside of a company, you need to have your regulatory approvals in place. And if you don't have that, it's really hard to pass through that gate, and it's really hard to develop. Speaking from sort of a smaller company mentality, where we're going out to get project finance for every project we're working on, you definitely won't attract outside investment if you can't show a robust regulatory pathway. And then as far as working in states that only have conventional, I mean, that's pretty common. Like the next generation of geothermal is just coming the here and now, right? We're borrowing from the fracking from oil and gas to do enhanced geothermal systems. The closed loop side is borrowing sort of the drilling techniques and long reach wells. But it's only the last 5 to 10 years that this is really gaining a lot of speed. So I think that's pretty normal around the world, that you only have those regulations in place. What we've found personally is an ability of these regulators that, like in Germany, for example, we're fully permitted and drilling right now. In Alberta, we put a pilot in, and there was no regulation for us. And there's just typically a willingness to sit and learn about the technology and about what the risks and uncertainties could be, and to try and sort of fit us into the existing regime. I mean, that's a good temporary solution while the industry is still nascent, but moving forward, obviously you want a bit more of a permanent solution. But it hasn't necessarily deterred us from going into a place. But if there's no geothermal regulation, I don't think we would go. And on the state side, we do tend to think things are easier when we go, but what we find is a lot of times the pathway is also uncertain because it's not super well defined. So that's just context for the company that I'm in, which I know would be very different from, say, a CERC or an ORMAT that has, plants across the country and, more cash flow and more ability to maybe balance different projects at different times. But even for them, I know there's been struggles on the regulatory, environmental regulatory side of things.
Great, thanks, Janine. Charlene, maybe anything to add? Thinking back to your industry days, I think most of the states you probably operated in had at least some level of geothermal regulations, but maybe the date of those geothermal regulations or other things that maybe deterred development or investment.
Yes, I think one thing too is even though a state could have regulations and even a Bureau of Land Management or a state lands commission that are familiar with geothermal, when you go into, at least in California, you go into a county that would be involved in geothermal, they may not have the experience. Even, I'll just say in California specifically, Imperial County in the southern part of the state has had a lot of experience doing the permitting side, which in California involves the California Environmental Quality Act. Whereas if you go to maybe another county in California, even Lake or Sonoma County, which have been involved in the geysers for 60 years, if there hasn't been anything new permitted in a long time, they may not have staff that are familiar with the process. So even though you can have familiarity because of regulations, you may not have local staff, even at a county or state level or federal level, that are familiar with geothermal, and you could still do a lot of educating on your type of process or, just geothermal in general. What's geothermal, and have to do really kind of a geothermal 101 to educate them. I think, unfortunately, some of the negatives of geothermal tend to be what people remember or I've heard about, whether it's induced seismicity or even volcanism, water use, biological or archaeological issues. And so it's important to be able to explain differences or why those were issues and they've been mitigated. So I think, to me, you can never educate too much, regardless, especially on if you have a different process like Ever or even ORMAT, which is different than a steam resource with the geysers. There's always there's always education to be done, because usually you don't have staff with expertise. And then the difference in whether a state regulates it as a fluid mineral like the Bureau of Land Management does versus a water right in some other states, that can definitely change how the resource is regulated.
Great, thanks, Charlene. Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point that some states we did see more deference to local counties or the ability for counties to take on some of that permitting. And so, yeah, there might even be some regulations at the state level, but how well are they defined and executed when there is that deference to the local jurisdiction can also be a consideration for states in terms of how much of that do they want uniform at the state level, how much is delegated to the counties. And I know some states, take different approaches to kind of that centralized versus decentralized permitting approach. In many cases, depending on the size of the state and some of the kind of political landscape. So, our final question before we open it up for audience questions is, what challenges do you see for EGS and closed loop projects related to geothermal leasing? Does this concept of geothermal anywhere make site identification and leasing easier or just different for these projects compared to hydrothermal development? And again, I'll start with Janine and then move on to Charlene.
I think the core sort of value proposition for any next generation geothermal technology, whether it's enhanced geothermal systems or advanced, meaning closed loop or hydraulic fracturing, is the creation or the engineering of an underground resource that doesn't normally exist. So you don't need to find sort of a niche aquifer. So hydrothermal typically has had to do that. And as Charlene just touched on, oftentimes you're looking for surface expressions of these hot springs, et cetera, which is linked to sort of oftentimes, tribal cultural practices or biodiversity things to consider. So I think there's just a long history there. And so when you come out to the next generation and the fact that you're creating an underground reservoir, it gives you, like, you're almost looking for a haystack, not the needle in the haystack. So I think there's just more flexibility, just in general in citing the projects. I mean, drilling down a little deeper. Sorry, guys, I'm in an open office and it's really difficult. I tried to find a quiet space. I'm so sorry. It's startup. We're all in one room. But I think, you know, when you consider heat, so heat is a local, you need to be near demand, basically. So, you know, your siting is, you need to site there. So it's easier for next generation to site, I think. And then buddying up, getting close to transmission is also easier for the next generation. So I think in general, I'd say more flexibility. If you're fracking, there could be different concerns in terms of just more proactive education and how close you can get to, say, a building or a school. But otherwise, I think it's probably easier. Yeah.
Arlene, thoughts there from your end?
Well, and CalGEM's not involved in leasing, but from the BLM and then California State Lands does leasing also. I think, you know, historically it's all been, I'll just say traditional geothermal steam or hot water. I don't know of any projects specifically leased, maybe on private land for enhanced geothermal systems right now. I'll just say, I think in California, there's such a negative connotation to the word fracking. And so I think, you know, Department of Energy's Forge project in Milford, Utah is very helpful in understanding technology and what can, you know, what it really involves to create a geothermal system. But again, education is key. I don't currently know of any projects proposed in California for enhanced geothermal system or closed loop, although I know some are looking at projects. And again, you know, going back to the regulations to ensure that they're adequate to address the concerns, but yet not prescriptive, but generic enough to address well construction and water use and the things that will be of concern to the public.
Great, thanks, Charlene. So with that, I'm going to move us into some of the questions that we have received in the chat. So thanks everyone for providing those and participating. I'll field some, and if I need to, I'll pass off to my esteemed colleagues here as well. And so this first one is the federal and state by state compilation of rules and regulations, definitions, you know, et cetera, categorized, available. I noticed that in the report, you only provide examples. And so I am seeking to provide this to everyone, and I'm going to put a link to the Rapid Toolkit, which is a tool that we have developed at NREL with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy, including the Geothermal Technologies Office, where we have laid out both federal and state level regulations for geothermal development in a number of Western states. We're actually going to be expanding that this year to include 3 new states, Arizona, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. We previously had, I believe, 12 or 13 states in there. So it's going to now be state level information for around 15 or 16 states, along with federal regulations. And so I'm looking to add the 50 state survey to that tool to make that widely available to everyone, hopefully within the next month or so, because we do feel like it is useful for everyone to be able to see these definitions and some of the procedures that we were able to collect from all of the states. So be on the lookout for that in the near future. The next question I'm going to look to is, there was one question here about well control procedures, processes for safety. We did not focus on some of that subsurface safety aspect within this in terms of casing, well blowout prevention, other aspects of that nature. I know there's other resources out there that are used for that purpose, including the BLM has their gold book, which provides a lot of information on that. I don't know, Charlene or Janine, if you have any other resources that you think are helpful for folks to look into for safety and well control procedures.
Yes, we actually have it called the MO7, and it's, if you go to conservation.ca.gov, and it includes a section on geothermal and the blowout prevention required. We look at the type of resource, the steam, for example. A steam resource is different than hydrothermal. We're looking at the temperatures and the pressures, and that determines the blowout prevention equipment that's required.
Great, thanks, Charlene. Another question we received was related to geothermal wells and brine used for lithium production. We did try to call out kind of what was included or what could be included within that geothermal resource definition, which is really where that interrelationship occurs. So I know in California, for example, the geothermal resource right does give you the right to what's in that geothermal brine, including the lithium. And so we're seeing some of that now occur down in the Salton Sea, where they're looking to both develop the geothermal resource and extract the lithium from it. Other states might include the minerals. It might include only minerals that don't have a certain level of value and kind of commercial use. And in other states, it is just the heat resource is what you're entitled to. And so you are not entitled to that mineral resource or other waters or other fluids within it, and that is required to be re-injected as part of the extraction process. So that is something that really does vary across the states, and something for states to consider. What are you looking to encompass within that geothermal resource definition, and does it include the rights to the minerals within that geothermal brine? Moving on to another question here as I scroll down our chat.
Aaron, can I just add to that?
Go ahead,
The regulation of, at least from the CalGEM's perspective in state lands, the State Lands Commission and the Bureau of Land Management would collect royalties from minerals recovered. CalGEM does not collect royalties. However, the wells that produce the fluids currently the wells at the Salton Sea resource, they already remove silica and salt from the brines to be able to inject them again. And so they're adding another process to the brines. So the wells that produce the brines don't change, and then all of the fluids are injected. And so we do regulate the injection of the fluids after the solids have been removed, whatever they are. So it doesn't change the permitting of the producer or the injector from our perspective.
Great, thanks, Charlene. Yeah, that was helpful. Another question we received is, will state regulations allow the redevelopment of existing conventional geothermal fields with EGS technology? And I think that, kind of at a high level, I can speak to that. There are, at the federal level, this is, maybe called a sundry notice when you're modifying existing wells. There are other processes, as we talked about, that need to be considered to either change the use of a well or kind of redevelopment and reworking of a well. I don't know if, Janine, if this is something that you all have to consider, if you're really looking at more greenfield development only. I know there's other companies out there like Green Fire and such that are really only looking to modify existing fields as part of their kind of development approach. And then Charlene, I don't know if there's any experience you have. And I know we've seen some of this on the federal level, like at Newberry up in Oregon, as part of a test project where they have tried to kind of enhance an existing hydrothermal system. And they've had to redevelop some of those wells, but I'll turn it over to you two.
I'll just jump in really quickly. But there's a comment in here that seems most EGS are currently employed in sedimentary dominated basins. I think the Utah Forge is actually a really good example. And also Furbo has a project at Blue Mountain in Nevada. So they're actually drilling horizontal wells in hard rock, whether it's granite or like a sedimentary rock. So that sort of oil and gas technology is extending out into the igneous volcanic metamorphic subsurface lithologies. As far as like redevelopment of fields, I don't think that that's really an issue, because if you are there's already typically, if there's an oil and gas regime in place, people are already drilling horizontal wells. They're already injecting. So I think there are at least some best practices to draw from, not to say that they can't be improved upon. Like we're working with the ECMC right now. By we, I mean the industry, the geothermal industry, on some rulemaking around deep geothermal regulations. These are some of the things that we're already considering. So I think with respect to your question, Aaron, on the entering wells, typically, if you're looking at an oil and gas well and you want to do sort of a bigger scale project, they're too small. Like the casing size is just too small. Also depends on the age of the well. You want to ensure that there's not going to be some sort of liability associated with that. So there's kind of got to be sort of checks and balances for what you're allowed to sort of re-enter and, you know, I guess repurpose. But companies are doing that, and it's been done in the past for lots of different reasons. So I just think the checks and balances need to be there. And I think that's about all I really had to add on that, Charlene. I don't know if you had something to add.
Yeah, I mean, you can unplug and abandon a well. If you know, we usually review the integrity of the well before it was plugged and abandoned the first time. Before re-entering, it can save a company substantial amounts of money if they can reuse a well. In California, you would also have to go through the California Environmental Quality Act, though, to redevelop a field. And then on the oil and gas side, if wells are going to be used that have hydrocarbons in it, our geothermal statutes are very clear that that well is not a geothermal well. And so it would be, its oversight would likely be seen by our oil and gas side and not our geothermal side.
Great, thanks, Charlene. We had another question that was kind of a modification to one of our panel questions. I can at least give my thoughts on this first, but it's how much of a risk is entering into a state without rules or clear rules on ownership of geothermal resources underlying private land. I mean, to me, this would be a huge red flag if you didn't have a clear understanding of what you were being able to even acquire from a private interest. And I know that we have a number of these maybe issues that are going to be arising in terms of surface versus subsurface ownership of a resource based off of different definitions. But Janine, Charlene, anything to add there? I mean, to me, again, not having regulations, if that's a red flag, not knowing what you even are getting the rights to seems like a much larger red flag.
I would agree. It's a huge red flag. And even sometimes just going into areas where it's like split ownership. I mean, it's a nightmare. You can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just researching to find out who owns it, let alone how you can access it. That's about really all I can say. That's my own personal experience. Charlene, you may have a regulatory perspective that I don't share here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think even one of the challenges, like in areas that they want to repurpose oil and gas, just not necessarily California and other states, is a lot of times the leases were originally very specific to oil and gas and excluded other things, other resources, or they might be specific to geothermal and not allow oil and gas. And so a company may need to renegotiate a lease to expand the use of the land. And I know Texas just passed new laws defining who owns the subsurface, which is different too. So yeah, definitely clarity on who owns the resources, who has the mineral rights, potentially the surface rights if it's split estate, two different owners. And it's like owning anything. You better make sure you have the ownership of it before you start drilling on it.
Great, thanks, Charlene. Yeah, recognizing we're down to a few minutes, I'm gonna try to get some additional questions. So one that I think is maybe relevant is, did the NREL study look at state local regulatory interactions? And if not, might that be looked at next? So I think, we mainly focused on the state level, as I previously talked about. Certainly some states are more deferential to that local jurisdiction or have the ability to authorize that local jurisdiction to adopt regulations in development. Charlene mentioned the example of Imperial County in California, where they have taken that approach. I actually have another study that we published last year out of NREL that looked at a few examples of specific development issues in both California in Imperial County, as well as in Nevada. And it is something we hone in on that report, looking to that role of Imperial County in terms of kind of what authority they have over the process versus the state. And Charlene, anything to add there specifically on kind of this California interaction?
Well, no, I think specific to California, so counties have a land use plan, and it's important to have a geothermal element to that land use plan. That may be critical for them to be able to actually regulate any kind of geothermal resource in their county.
Great. Yeah, looking through this, so there was a question that came up about kind of tribal nations and the applicability of this to tribal nations. I do think that can be a very distinct issue. It really depends on the individual tribe in terms of what kind of authority they have over the land. Is it trust land that is managed in coordination with the Bureau of Indian Affairs? Is it fee land that they've purchased as a tribe and have really kind of full autonomy over? We did also publish another report, and I can try to get both of these reports I'm mentioning out to the group, maybe in a follow-on thank you email. I'll work with my communications team, but we looked at this for another report where we actually held a couple of tribal listening sessions with a number of tribes, both in California and Nevada. And we do see some of that interest in actually them understanding kind of how to develop and regulate geothermal themselves. Other tribes really trying to better understand how do they participate in the process, if it is more of a BIA managed interest, or if they have maybe cultural or spiritual significance in a resource that is off tribal land. And so we did produce those findings and publish those from what we heard from individual tribes. I think in the sense that if a tribe does have full autonomy to regulate, I think that a number of these issues could be considered equally for tribes that would have this authority over that land, as they were a state. As a tribe being a sovereign nation, they certainly could adopt some of these. And quite frankly, Janine has found, not in the tribal context, but even other countries, kind of using that same analogy of a tribe being a sovereign nation. We've seen this, that there's now countries in Europe that are looking to some of this report and seeing what is helpful to them and how it can be used. So I certainly think there's some transferability to tribal nations, other countries, and the like that can be used. I do think there's obviously some distinctions with tribal nations within this country, and again, that kind of cultural and spiritual aspect of development of some of these resources that we've seen, particularly with hot springs and things of that nature, that need to be considered. And certainly I can refer everyone to that report that we published. Janine?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is something I'm a bit passionate about, because we do work in Canada, in the Yukon, with Indigenous groups there, and they're actually part owners of the project. The difference there is that it's still regulated by the local regulator, but they actually own the land and they are sovereign. I think from a regulatory and safety perspective, I think it's a capacity building issue. Just in general, even in like county offices, we haven't really talked about it too much here, but I think a lot of us are familiar, that it takes a very long time to get permits back, to get feedback, just to lack of capacity, lack of understanding, people retiring. I think the issues translate very similarly to the tribal aspect of this. So one way to debottleneck that could just be that interagency sort of MOU where it's still regulated, where it should be regulated, but they still kind of have the sovereignty over their own land. That's just kind of my 2 cents worth, not being local, but it is good to have them included. And, there's not always going to be a hot spring or a surface expression. Like, I think I urge this group to think beyond what geothermal has traditionally been, to think about what the future can hold. And on the eastern United States, there's a lot of, hot sedimentary aquifers. That's low-hanging fruit that is going to come. That's, not drilling deep, but it's still deep. So, there's a lot more that we could talk about here, but we have to, really try and think bigger and what the future can look like in 20 years from now, and what the regulatory regime potentially do to sort of nurture that.
Great. Charlene, anything to add from California?
No, I'll just say tribal resources are really important, and not only does the federal government have requirements for nation to nation consultation, but California has its own state of regulations to do the same thing on any kind of project, not just geothermal.
Great, thanks. So with that, we are at the top of our hour. Again, I wanted to thank Stephen Emmon from the Western Governors Association. Encourage everyone to look at their report. Also, thank you to Janine, Charlene, and quite frankly, the rest of our working group that worked with us to develop this report. We've been really excited to see the amount of attention and traction it's received since its release. And thanks everyone today for joining us and providing these thoughtful questions. And encourage you again, please look at the report and feel free to reach out to NREL with questions you may have. I also saw that Faith Smith, one of my colleagues, put those other 2 reports that I spoke to in the chat, so those are available. And then finally, I just want to mention that this is being recorded today, and we will get this posted afterwards. So if those are looking to go back and review any of it today or refer it to colleagues, this will be available on the NREL YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that that notice is provided as well. So with that, again, thanks everyone, and have a great holiday season.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye, everyone.